Good afternoon. Welcome to the continuation of our Windover Weekend. It's great to see a packed house here for this presentation, the Windover Archaeology, the next generation, and we'll be talking about the past, present, and future of this amazing discovery. And we'll be taking your questions, so please, as we talk, think about what you'd like to ask at the end of the presentation. And this free presentation is made possible by the Florida Humanities Council. We got a generous grant from them to help us out with Windover Weekend, and that's why we're able to present this for free and have you enjoy the exhibit for free today. So thanks to the Florida Humanities Council. We have a great panel here, starting from your right to left. We have Dr. Geoffrey Thomas, specialist faculty at the Florida State University Department of Anthropology. Next to him is Dr. Rochelle Marrinan, who is chair of the Florida State University Department of Anthropology. Next to her is Dr. Rachel Wentz, author of the book Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, and a couple of other books on archaeology as well. And at the end there is Patrisha Meyers, director of this facility, the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and also director of the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. I'm executive director of the Florida Historical Society, and will be moderating this panel discussion. Please welcome our guests. Well, first of all, as you probably know, in 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjack was working up in Titusville near the intersection of Interstate 95 and State Road 50, and he was clearing away muck with his backhoe, and he noticed this round brownish object that he'd uncovered, and he got down and looked and saw that he'd uncovered a skull and actually a couple of other sets of human skeletal material. So it was determined pretty quickly that this was not the site of a serial killer's burial ground or something, and so they called in a young up-and-coming anthropologist named Glenn Doran from Florida State University. He became chair later, and Dr. Marrinan has succeeded him as chair of that department. And they knew they'd found an amazing discovery, certainly Native American in origin, but did carbon dating tests, and it was determined that these remains were between 7,000 and 8,000 years old. Just a remarkable discovery. 3,200 years older than King Tut, just for some comparison, 2,000 years older than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. Just a remarkable discovery. And some of you were here last night and heard some comments from Jim Swan about the initial days there, because he was the one who was head of the construction company building the Windover Farm subdivision. But let's start with Rachel. Let's start with you. You interviewed all of these folks for your book, the backhoe operator and Jim Swan, and so tell us a little bit about the principal people who discovered these human remains and those early days of discovery in 1982.
Well, it was a thrill for me to write the book because I didn't take part in the dig. That was long before I was an archaeologist. So I had come to Florida State in 2001 and had the good fortune of being directed by Glenn Doran for my bioarchaeological studies, and he oversaw my master's thesis and my dissertation. So all those years working under Glenn, I had heard the stories of Windover and how it was discovered, and read his book, of course, which is we call it the Bible of the Windover site because it is truly phenomenal. And so when I decided to write the book geared toward a general audience, because this will kill you if you try to read it, I wanted to write a book so that everybody could learn about this site because it was so fascinating. And of course, Ben, helped me tremendously because FHS Press published the book. So I got tremendous support from FHS. And so I started nailing down all these key players. And of course, I started with Jim Swan because he owned the land. He was kind of steering the whole project. And if it hadn't been for Jim, really the site never would have been excavated because it was his exceptional interest and dedication to natural science and his curiosity about who these skeletons were, who they belonged to, how old they were, what they could tell us about ancient Florida that really drove all of the research that was done, all of the excavations. And what I learned by talking to all the players was that not only did he provide access to the site and, delay and reroute a lot of the construction, but he even paid for a lot of the manpower. He provided a lot of the machinery for moving the earth, because every time they did the excavations, they had to actually dewater the whole pond so that they could work within it. So it was incredibly labor intensive. And so from each one of these key players, it took me about a month and a half to track down Steve Vanderjack, who was the backhoe operator. No one knew where he was. I finally tracked him down at his little compound down south. But it was a thrill to talk to these people. And my question I really wanted to ask Steve was, okay, when you picked up what you thought was that stone and turned it over and saw that it was a skull, what was the first thing that came to your mind? And he said, "Oh, I can't say." And I said, "No, say it." And he said, "Oh, shit." So it was just, and hearing all these different stories from the players, that's why we decided on the title, Life and Death at Windover, because I not only wanted to tell the story of the skeletons and who these people were, but I wanted to tell the story of the people that worked on the site and what it was like for them on a daily basis. What was their daily routine like? They told me about staying in Titusville and, eating oranges and going to the beach after the field work. So it was an incredible education from my perspective. I'd worked on the skeletons for years, but never really knew what it was like. And so that's something we hope to get across in the book, was what that whole experience was like, discovering this site, excavating the site, working as diligently as they all did, and then what we've come to know since then through research of not only the skeletons but the artifacts. This book really contains all of the heavy scientific information that's been gleaned from this site. Not only the artifacts, but the soil chemistry, the soil profiles, the geological history of the pond itself. So if you're really into that heavy material, this book really contains all of that. It's a fabulous read.
Well, Dr. Marrinan, there were three field excavations between 1984 and 1986, and you were actually at those. This wet site that allowed for such amazing preservation, which we haven't really talked about yet, how well preserved all of this material was, but that also presented problems for the archaeological team at the beginning, right?
A lot of problems. One of the real problems in Florida is water. I mean, sometimes you have too little, and sometimes you have too much. With excavations, depending on where you are, it can really be a problem. And here we had a pond to begin with. So getting the water out was something that had to be done. And well point systems, which are used primarily in construction in Florida, you've probably seen them whether you realize it or not, on construction sites for roads and for buildings and things of that sort. You'll see a long line of headers and then little pipes that come off to the side, and they basically suck the water out of the underground, and how deep they suck it out is how deep you basically put the well points in. So dewatering this pond was a fine art, in the sense that you wanted it to stay moist but not wet. You wanted it to stay moist but not too dry, and you had to be able to work. So one of the things you see in most of the photographs is that even the weight of a person working there can be a real problem, and you can also bring in things on your shoes. So normally they put plywood down to walk on, so that when you came in, you kind of disperse your weight, and you're not mashing footprints and things like that into the floor of the excavation. So there are many different kinds of problems, and of course you can see one of the problems on the front of this book and some of these other pictures you've seen, and it's wide open. So shade is another issue, because you have people working, and most of the time these excavations were done in the fall. In one instance, I think there was actually a hurricane or tropical storm, and that's a problem too, having the site open. Once you open a site, you really have to work very fast, because you don't know what the weather is that's coming. And with a site like this, you really cannot cover it completely with plastic and things of that sort. It's too big. So there were many different logistical problems that had to be solved, not the least of which was really techniques for removing burials, because it's a tedious job. You want to remove each bone. You want to expose it so that it can be photographed and then mapped in place, and then it has to be removed. And you want to do that without inflicting new scars on the bones and things like that, which basically would give you a kind of false idea of perhaps an injury or something of that sort. So it's very difficult, very tedious work, and so you have to have a field crew that can do that. Not everyone has the patience for excavating burials. And so it is really an art, and even in the lab, we were looking at the skull that was put back together again. One of the people on the field crew had just an incredible knack for reassembling skulls from just fragments, and that is absolutely a skill that doesn't come to many. So there were many different things that really had to be thought out and taken care of. Another thing I just want to mention that we haven't talked about at all was one of the first things that Glenn did was to hire a conservator. In other words, when these bones come out of the ground, they're wet. And in the air, they begin to dry. And they will torque, they will break, and they will shrink. So right away, they have to be kept in a bath, and then some kind of stabilizing material has to be used on them to keep them in a stable situation, basically, as we see them today. So the conservator was a very important part of all this. And so all human remains, all the faunal remains, the food and or just the natural life and death of fish and turtles and birds and things of that sort in the pond, all of those things have been stabilized so that now we have them, we can work with them without fear that this is going to happen, essentially. So working in a wet site offers many opportunities to see the kinds of materials that people had and a fuller idea of their material culture. In other words, the things of their lives. But it also means that you've got to really anticipate what you might find and be ready for it. And oftentimes ready for things you never expected, like human brains, for example.
Yeah. And if that anaerobic environment had the perfect pH balance to preserve 168 intact burials wrapped in some of the oldest woven cloth found in North America. As you mentioned, 91 of the skulls had intact brain matter, just amazingly well-preserved site. Patty Meyers, the Windover dig is reconstructed here. In fact, that's what we've been doing this weekend, is opening the greatly refreshed and expanded Windover People of Windover exhibit. And the Windover dig is recreated as part of that. Tell us about that portion of the exhibit and what that recreation consists of.
Well, most of you, I hope, have had a chance to walk through the Windover dig. If you haven't, we're open until 5, so there'll be plenty of time after this. What you'll see is a recreation of what it would have been like when they cut the peat away. We have painted representations of stratigraphy, which is how archaeologists tell time, what was happening at different times based on these different layers of dirt or peat, whatever you're working in. We have panels that we have redesigned. These are all new panels if you've been here before. A lot of time has passed, new information is coming out. That's part of what you'll hear on the panel today. Research is constantly ongoing on this collection, so we've updated our panels. There is one that explains the stratigraphy. There's one that explains the timeline. That's always a question. How did the people of Windover fit into human occupation of Florida? So there's a great timeline there to help you visualize that. The most exciting part of the dig right now are the artifacts that we've borrowed from Florida State University. We're very honored to have them here on loan to us. Every artifact that's in one of the black cases is an actual artifact from Windover, with the exception of the atlatl, which is a recreation of one that was found at Windover. So that is just a really exciting part of the archaeological mock-up, is what we would call it. There's a burial there, and that's always one of the highlights, especially when we get young visitors here. It's a representation of many burials that were found at Windover. It's based mostly on burial 90, although it is not an exact replica of that particular burial, but that was a very interesting one. A lot of artifacts were found there. If you look just above where the burial is, that case has 3 of the artifacts that were found with burial 90, and then there's a list in the case that tells you some of the others that were found with it. That was a burial of a child between the ages of maybe 11 and 12 and a half. What was really interesting about that burial is, in addition to this young child, there were the remnants of a woven bag, and we know that because part of the drawstring area of the bag survived, and within that bag were 5 fragments of long bones from a neonate, so that's right around the time of birth. We don't know exactly what the association between these 2 individuals might have been, but we do believe there was some association between them, perhaps siblings. It's hard to say, but that's part of the fascination with bioarchaeology, is all of these mysteries that we continue to explore.
Well, Dr. Thomas, following the initial discovery of remains and artifacts at Windover, they were quickly taken to local labs, and they're documented and protected there. But for the past several decades, these materials have been preserved and studied at Florida State University. How has that benefited researchers there?
I mean, it's really one of the largest skeletal populations in the U.S. that's that old. I want to say there's only about another 100 or so individuals that date to around 8,000 or older, and most of those are single site burials. So of any sites in the U.S., it really is the largest and oldest and one of the most well preserved. So it really has benefited greatly a lot of researchers who are looking at kind of an extremely old hunter-gatherer group from Florida, or even from just the Southeast in general. We've had a lot of new research being done by undergraduates. We have constant kind of researchers coming to visit and measuring things. I know Patty wants to come back.
Yep, absolutely.
And do more, because it's just such an unbelievably fascinating site. And I mean, in the video you see, and in some of these pictures, that I mean, some of the remains are just, you pull them out of the drawer and you think they're somebody that died maybe 10 years ago. They're so well preserved. They just look absolutely immaculate. And we're really moving into kind of more of a digital realm as well in terms of our studies. So I know we're working on now is actually 3D scanning a couple of the actual remains from Windover. We're going to try to get them 3D printed at the Florida State University Arts Research Facility, and then give you guys the 3D prints of the actual remains. So that's kind of an ongoing project that I think we're going to keep open between us and the museum. Absolutely. Here, which will be fantastic. So you guys are really the only kind of public outlet that we have for the site in general. So.
Great. Well, Dr. Wentz, you earned your graduate degrees working with the Windover remains. What was the nature of your research?
Well, I came from a background of healthcare. I was a firefighter paramedic for 13 years before I came to Florida State for my degrees. So when I got there, I had no idea what Windover was, had never heard of it. And so when Glenn took me into the lab and said, "Look at this," I was a very happy bioarchaeology student. And so one of the things I loved about being a paramedic was traumatic injury. So for my master's thesis, the first thing I wanted to look at was traumatic injury among Windover. Because what we do when we're looking at examining skeletons, we try to infer what their culture was like, what their social structure was like, and a lot of that we can infer by the state of these remains. And trauma analysis plays a big role in that, because we can look at traumatic injury, we can infer interpersonal conflict, warfare, even in some cases what type of implements were used on each other. And so I was just curious what it would look like, what skeletal fractures would look like in a 7,000-year-old population. And what I found by examining all the fractures, out of the 168 people, there were a total of 90 fractures among them. And we can look at different degrees of healing, where these fractures are located on the body. Kind of sometimes you can tell what might have caused that type of fracture. But what I found for that research was that males and females had about the same amount of fractures, and they all looked to be accidental in nature. There was no real indication that there was a lot of interpersonal conflict. The juveniles had very low rates of fracture, so we don't see any instances of potential child abuse that we've seen in some other populations. So it was just really interesting, and it gave us a little bit more information about what their social structure was like. For my dissertation, I wanted to look at all aspects of health, and so what I did was there was a new tool out called the Western Hemisphere Health Index, and it was a health index that was developed by a few researchers that actually you go in and look at every element of the skeleton and you can gauge it for varying types of pathology, looking at rates of infection, arthritis, dental disease, traumatic injury, and what you do is you score all these different bones, and when we're talking about 168 people, we're talking about 10,000 bones in this collection. So it means going over every single little bone and looking for any signs of pathology, giving each individual an overall score as to how much pathology, the types of pathology, the level of involvement on the body, and then getting an overall score for the population. And once you have that population score, then you can compare it to other populations that have been scored using this technique. And I was very curious because Windover was the oldest skeletal population ever applied, that the Windover Health Index had ever been applied to. And what I found was that they had much higher levels of, say, infection and certain types of pathology, but yet they had fairly substantial lifespans. You know, we tend to think of ancient populations as having very brief lifespans, and for the most part, most of them do. But there are some exceptionally elderly individuals at Windover, 50, 60 years old and beyond. So it was interesting to take, as Jeff said, a hunter-gatherer population and see how they compared in various types of pathology to more contemporaneous populations and populations from around the world utilizing different types of subsistence practices like agriculture. And that research is summarized in the book. The back half of this book is all the health information, what we've been able to glean by looking at pathology, and kind of a much more scaled down version of that dissertation. So. But it's been fascinating having the ability to do that. And as Jeff said, the only way we're able to do that is with well-preserved remains. If you just have a few bones from an individual, it's hard to say something about that individual as a person. But when you have these very complete skeletons in many cases, and when the bones are very well preserved, we can observe things like infection, like fractures. When we have teeth, you've seen the teeth, they're frightening to look at because they're so worn, heavily worn, but we can look at things like dental abscesses, dental caries, and things like that.
Well, Dr. Marrinan, over the past few decades, what were some of the most important discoveries made or conclusions drawn from these Windover materials? We were just hearing about Dr. Wentz's studies, but what were some of the other things that people have looked at?
One of the questions we had about the Windover folks has to do with sedentism. We think of people who are sedentary as couch potatoes. One of the things that anthropologists are interested in is how sedentary a population can be, and sometimes we're not quite sure what we mean by that. When we think of a sedentary population today, we think of people living in one place for extended periods of time, possibly even whole lifetimes. But sedentism in prehistory may be more like a couple of years, or a kind of situation of a base camp, and then in other periods of a year, people moving out into the areas around a base camp when things are rougher, maybe in the winter. We see this, for example, in some areas. With the Windover folks, we wanted to know whether they were nomadic or what. We weren't really sure. One of the problems, one of the mysteries always has been about Windover is where the people came from, who came to this pond to leave their dead. There were several midden areas. A midden is an accumulation of refuse. If you threw all your trash out your back door, you would have a midden in no time. And our landfills are huge middens, all right? Okay, so we have a few middens in the area around the Windover site itself, but none of those has been shown to be ancient as the people in the bog. So precisely where they lived is a question that we have, and possibly unanswerable given the development around the area. Isotopic analysis that's been done on their bones, looking at various isotopes. We wanted to know, for example, what was their relationship with coastal things? Did they go to the coast? Did they? We have shark's teeth and other sorts of things. Where did those things come from? The isotopes suggest that they were not going to the coast. That they basically were in the marshes and wetlands, basically, of the Upper St. Johns. This region essentially. And I think it's important to remember too that they could have taken a shark in the St. Johns. They could have taken rays and other kinds of things that we see, even marine fishes, because studies that have been done on the St. Johns have shown that there are marine specimens all the way up. I mean, blue crabs. When I was a kid, I used to be able to get blue crabs from people along the St. Johns because the crabs were there and abundant. So I think we've learned really more about their area of concentration, but again, precisely where they were living is something that we don't know and may not ever really know. But that would be a wonderful thing to know. So that's one of the things. I think that many of you may be asking yourselves, why does Florida State University have these things, right? Okay, all right. Here's the story. We did not get the first phone call. The University of Florida did, because they had a forensic anthropology program. And their take on these materials was that they weren't that old, and that while the site should be preserved, they weren't particularly interested in it. So the second call came to Florida State. And Dr. Daly, who was the senior physical anthropologist, and Dr. Doran, who had just come really to Florida State in 1980. So he was the new kid on the block, and also the new kid in Florida. And it takes a while, if you're from Texas and California, to understand Florida archaeology and to kind of get in. So Daly brought him down. They looked at the remains. They thought they were very interesting, but they thought, we need a radiocarbon date. We need to understand how old these folks are. And when the radiocarbon date came back as ancient as it is, then there was great excitement about this. And so Florida State continued, but the excavation didn't take place right away. The excavation and much of the work that's been done on site in Titusville was funded by the legislature over a 3-year period, approximately $300,000 each year for 3 years. And that's what made it possible. So your tax dollars actually at work with the archaeologists basically on this. And Florida State University now has an obligation to maintain these folks in perpetuity. And so that is why Glenn will ultimately turn over all of the activity to folks like Jeff, and we're also hiring a new physical anthropologist who will come in and be kind of the new custodian for these remains. She right now is in a genetics program at Stanford, and so we think that if there is hope for getting DNA material from the Windover folks, that she may well be the one to do that. Maybe not right away, but as new techniques become available, I think that will probably happen. It's one of the things we truly hope for.
Dr. Thomas, how have the Windover materials changed our perceptions of archaic age people?
I think it's diversified our ideas about behavior with the archaic populations. Most of the time when we think of archaic, it's hunter-gatherers, it's atlatl, large game hunting. Some people are even thinking megafauna, and generally the megafauna die out around 10,000, so they're gone by now. And kind of across the country, different hunter-gatherers are really doing different things. Part of my dissertation was looking at upper limb asymmetry. So right side of the arm versus left side of the arm. And if you're right-handed, your right is a lot bigger and a lot stronger. And generally, if you're right-handed, your left is particularly useless, especially in our modern culture. But I found a lot of hunter-gatherers that do large game hunting, white-tailed deer hunting, things like that. The males are ridiculously right-handed. The rights are absolutely huge, and the lefts are very small. Whereas agricultural groups are much more symmetrical. They're doing things with both arms, males and females. But Windover is very symmetrical. They're much more like an agricultural group than a typical atlatl hunting hunter-gatherer group. So they really were doing totally different things. So I think the kind of overgeneralization of all hunter-gatherers basically behave the same way is really not true at all. I mean, they're adapted to their specific climates. They're using their specific resources. They're doing completely different things. I mean, with the intricacies of their basketry and just textile work, I mean, they had to have been doing maybe nets or fishing or something that maybe just didn't preserve or we don't have evidence for in terms of more of their focus rather than like large game atlatl throwing, although they did a little of that as well. But yeah.
And the material culture also kind of broke some of those stereotypes about division of labor, because the studies on the material remains, what people were buried with. Typically, if you're buried with something, that object means something to you. And when we're talking about tools and technology, it's typically what that person probably used in life. And it was surprising to find that many of the implements that went along with creating the textiles were actually buried with males. And that there was no heavy concentration of any type, tools weren't just found with males, tools were found with females as well.
And subadults.
And subadults, they were buried with children, so it's really shaken up a lot of
usually like a hunter-gatherer group typically has kind of achieved rank. So as you get older, you get more respect, you get more grave goods, right? Kind of higher level grave goods. And then we find all these things with children who haven't had time to gain all that respect and notoriety, yet they still have kind of these nice grave goods that even some of the adults don't have. So yeah, it's really different.
I think there's a misperception too that prehistoric people might abandon or even kill the weakest members of their society, but Windover proved that to not be true, right?
Yeah, I mean, with the spina bifida boy is just, he was, 15 or so?
He was an older teenager, and that was probably one of the main factors that we found from looking at the pathologies, is realizing that these people lived with a lot of illness and injuries, and yet they weren't abandoned. They lived for many, many years. You'll see a picture of a beautiful, well, it's not, I think it's a beautiful fracture. But it's this incredible fractured femur, and this was an elderly female that fractured this femur years and years ago. And when you think in terms, even today, if you fracture a femur, you're in big trouble, because you're getting that rod in, you're getting it pinned, you're staying in traction. It's a very lengthy healing process, so I'm hoping it pops up in perfect timing. But to think of this woman, how did she manage to fracture this, which has kept me up at night many, many nights wondering how she did that. But the fact that she fractured it, was able to stay immobile, people taking care of her, bringing her necessities, her water, everything, so that she had the time to heal, and the fact that she would have had a significant limp for the rest of her life, which would have made it very difficult when you're considering hunting and gathering and just taking care of yourself. So yes, it told us a lot about, and the boy with spina bifida, we think he was paralyzed. He had what's called disuse atrophy. His lower limbs were wasted away, so he wasn't walking. Every time the group moved, they would carry him. So there was a lot of evidence. There it is. See? Is that a beauty or what? That is a spectacular fracture. That's the spina bifida's boy's legs.
That's the
massive,
lower leg.
Massive
Shin.
infection to his lower extremities. We think he may have even lost his foot at some point in life. So someone was taking care of him for almost 18 years. So it's
Yeah.
really something.
I think another thing that changed perceptions was the textiles.
Oh, yeah.
No one expected to see textiles this complex at this time period. And Windover has now, the collections basically are one of the largest textile collections in the Western Hemisphere, and definitely from this time period.
And there's a great diorama in the exhibit that shows the intricate weavings and how they must have been created on a rudimentary loom. So check that out because it's a really interesting piece of information.
Well, Patty Meyers, we've been talking about lab work and some of the discoveries. There's a new portion, brand new portion of the People of Windover exhibition that allows visitors to really get a feel for what some of this lab work is like. Tell us about that.
Well, the lab portion is everything in Windover is exciting, but it was really exciting when we started brainstorming how we can improve the exhibit. And for the whole museum, one of the things I'd like to do is make it more interactive, because I really believe no matter how old you are, whether you're in school as a young student or you're an adult, when you do something, you remember it better. So as physical anthropologists, we have a variety of techniques that we use to build a biological profile. Who was this? How old were they? Was it a male or a female? How tall were they? And we've put out, we have a generous donation from Bone Clones, which is one of the leading suppliers of teaching material from their cast from real human bones. So while they are not human skeletal material, we treat them with the same respect because someone donated their body so that these could be created. We have the bone clones out there, and we have teaching panels in the back that go through some of the different attributes we look at. If you're looking at a skull, what makes it more likely to be a woman's skull than a man's skull? If you're looking at the pelvic area, of course, women go through childbirth, so we're designed a little differently than men are. And we have an osteometric board out. That's when you go back there, the big wooden instrument. And you would put a long bone in there, measure it, and put it into a simple regression formula to determine how tall this person might have been. Ideally, we like to have all the long bones in the body, but if you don't have all the long bones, and sometimes that is the case, you would use, hopefully, the femur. That's the best indicator, if not maybe the humerus or a combination of the two. But you can go back there, and on our lab table, try your hand and use the instruction panels, see what you think. How old was this? We have a juvenile skull. That's one of the best ways to age a child is through the dentition, because dental eruption happens at a fairly regular course. There's some variation.
And there's a picture of dental eruption. See the teeth coming up. Seriously, that's a juvenile jaw, and those are teeth erupting through the jaw.
Right through, yep. So those are the things that I hope people will enjoy. You can handle them. We ask you to handle with respect. But try your hand at being a physical anthropologist for a day. But keep in mind, this is just a small portion of the type of analyses that we do. We do much more in order to come up with our whole skeletal report and biological profile on each individual.
Well, we've talked about the past and the present of the Windover materials. Dr. Marrinan, the Windover materials were discovered, excavated more than 30 years ago now, and have been studied during that time. What does the future hold for the Windover archaeology?
I don't think we know. One of the things that's very true is that for anyone who's been in, I'm an archaeologist basically, and I was born about a couple of years before radiocarbon dating was born, which was right after World War II. So radiocarbon dating changed archaeology incredibly, because prior to that time, most archaeologists spent their time trying to create regional chronologies. In other words, for the Titusville, Brevard County area, they would excavate in sites. They would find out, kind of which pottery came first, which projectile points came first, and then they would build a chronology. And and you get to arguing over stone points and potsherds a lot. So when radiocarbon dating came along, it provided the opportunity to test those local chronologies and then to go on from there to other things. So archaeologists began to think about, okay, what else can we do? Well, some recognized that there were other things in archaeological sites beside pottery and stone tools, and of course human remains, and in some areas architecture and things of that sort. And so they began to look at how can we rebuild the environment? Well, we can do that from the kinds of animals and plants that people used. So new specialties in archaeology began to be developed. One called zooarchaeology, which is a combination of zoology, meaning vertebrate and invertebrate remains were studied, and then an archaeobotanist, or sometimes called a paleoethnobotanist. They're big, long names. But anyway, this is the plant side. And so today we have specialists who do these kinds of things. And so what we hope to do is bring a lot of information to bear on understanding not only the people at the site, but the environment in which they lived. And one of the things that was important at Windover was understanding how the regime, in other words, the ecological regime, had changed through time. Sometimes it seemed that the pond was relatively open and there was sawgrass around the edges. Other times it seemed that there were kind of changes and there were willows growing alongside, and that's basically what created those peat levels. So what the future is, well, and I also should say, when isotopic analysis came along, we applied those kinds of things. So what we basically do is try to pay attention to the new kinds of technologies that are being devised in other fields and take advantage of those for answering questions or asking new kinds of questions that we never knew we wanted to ask in 1984, for example, of this particular group of people from the excavation. So we don't know precisely what the future is, but we know, for example, in the department that we have an obligation to make certain that these remains are safe in perpetuity and that they are available to scholars who come to apply these kinds of new technologies. And so that's how I understand my responsibility.
Sure. Well, DNA testing, of course, was in its infancy when these remains were found, and of course, most of the graduate students doing work these days weren't even born when this happened. Dr. Thomas, you mentioned the 3D work that's being done. What do you see as some of the things that can happen in the future research of the Windover materials?
I mean, what would be great would be kind of digitization of the entire collection. I mean, that's, years in the making right there, just because there are so many fragments. But I think as 3D technology becomes more applicable and easier to use, a little bit cheaper, we can basically create kind of an online database where you can go in and actually measure bones. So you can come into the site, come into the department, do your own measurements, or you can just kind of pull up different files, 3D print them in your lab, and then you can measure your own 3D prints of 8,000-year-old skeletons. I mean, there's I think a lot of potential, at least, with all this additional technology, especially for accessing the remains. So we can have students in Europe, all over the world, really kind of accessing and using, gathering data on the remains themselves, without necessarily having to come to visit the site or visit the collection.
Well, Dr. Wentz, with all this access, if it does become widespread, is there still a lot of work to be done on this material?
Forever. I mean, because as Dr. Marrinan said, as technology changes, we'll be able to do more. And as Dr. Thomas said, access is the biggest thing. And for the longest time, physical anthropology or biological anthropology, whichever you prefer to call it, really suffered from that. There was a lot of observer error. Patty can measure a bone, I'll measure a bone, and my measurement's probably more correct.
It probably is. She's been doing it longer.
We'll get two different numbers. And so there was that problem. And when I did my dissertation work with the Western Hemisphere Health Index, that was one of the reasons they came up with that health index. It was very rigidly defined exactly how you measure that bone so that we all do it exactly the same, and then we can all compare all that data. So as Jeff said, if we can make all of this information accessible to other researchers, then everybody's sharing, everybody's doing it the same way, and Patty knows how important that is, because with all of her forensic work is you have to have consistency in your data collection to be able to compare to other sites, other time periods. So getting access to that information, I think, is the most important thing about getting it out there so that these comparisons can be made, because then we can understand the big picture of human culture. It's one thing to have one skeleton on the table and learn all about that person, or even a population like Windover. We may be able to make some definitive statements about maybe how these people were living, what they were doing, but until we put it into the grander scheme of things and see how things changed over time, how health changed over time, whether it's height or infection or degenerative joint disease, that's when we start understanding how culture evolves and how people change. So.
Well, other parts of the new exhibition that you're going to see, or maybe you have seen, but if you haven't, we certainly want you to walk back after our presentation concludes here. Part of that is the Windover woman sculpture that was done using these measurements. It was based on forensic reconstruction technology and actual measurements of a Windover skull, and it is really amazing, as you'll see, to look into the eyes of someone who lived here between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. There's also a new video that's actually a draft of an episode of our new Florida Frontiers television series that's going to be airing on public television stations around the state beginning in January. It's an extension of our Florida Frontiers radio program, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society. So that's all part of this exhibit too, and we've talked about other aspects, but I want to ask Patty Meyers, will this new exhibition perhaps inspire future generations of anthropologists and archaeologists?
Well, I hope that it does. But what I hope it inspires more than just scientists in our specific discipline is curiosity about the human condition, what it is that makes us who and what we are. That's really what anthropology is about. It's about studying humanity. And for those of you that don't know, here in the United States, we have a four-field approach to anthropology. There's physical, or as we said, biological. You can interchangeable words, or you can academically discuss why one's better than the other. But those of us that study human remains. And then there are archaeologists who study the material culture. There are cultural anthropology, people that in the past we would think of them as ethnographers. They went out and lived the way a specific group lived. But they also study modern populations. There's a student at school who was studying the anthropology of the types of individuals who would choose yoga as a exercise form. But as silly as it sounds, there's something to be learned from all of us in our choices that we make in life culturally. And then there are linguistics. And that side of anthropology, it's the smallest and maybe one of the most important sides, because we lose languages every day. We used to have such diverse just linguistic around the world, but as we become more global, there's a lot of good that comes out of it, but we also lose certain things as well. So that's what I hope people take away from the idea of what is anthropology, why are we who and what we are. And yes, I hope they become anthropologists, or whether it's archaeology, physical anthropology, or whether it's a totally different field of science, because we've become more and more cross-disciplinary. So we have geneticists who work with us. We have chemical analysts who aren't anthropologists, but still can contribute to the work that we do. So that's what I hope.
Great. Well, I know some of you must have some questions for our panel. Yes, right over here.
Well, I've been dying to find out more about the DNA. Once you can have that kind of ability, what would that tell us?
I mean, we could see about modern relatedness. If any modern groups could be tied to the Windover individuals, as well as the ancestry of themselves. So what kind of the regions are they coming from? The general consensus is Siberia is kind of the birthplace of most of the North American and South American indigenous populations. Probably 15, maybe 18,000 years ago, depending on pre-Clovis and all these other debates. But really kind of it would get a better definitive answer in terms of how Windovers related to their own ancestry, how they're related to other local groups in the Southeast, and then maybe even descendants of the group today.
And they were able to get DNA. It was very fragmented. In fact, when the brains were discovered, they were really hopeful that perhaps these soft tissues would be able to produce DNA, but the tissue was so degraded from being in a water environment. But the DNA that they were able to extract, they identified Windover as belonging to what's called the X haplogroup, and a haplogroup is a cluster of genes. And what they found is that's a very rare haplogroup to North America. It is, they were able to trace it back to Asian stock. So we know that when, we don't know when, we don't know how or where, but originally these people came from Asia. But hopefully, as the technique is more refined, and as Dr. Marrinan said, if perhaps new research can even extract some better, more high-quality DNA, that it can answer a tremendous amount of questions.
There's also a new development in DNA that I'm really interested in because I'm fascinated with the juvenile remains. It's an area that I've done a little bit of study on. And they are trying to develop an in-the-field DNA to be able to test whether it's a male or female, because until we hit puberty and the secondary sex characteristics kick in, it's very, very difficult to tell if a juvenile is male or female. And that's another area of DNA testing that I think is fascinating because, as we said, when you look at the grave goods that are buried with an individual, you start to make some assumptions about what this might mean. And you can also look at trauma patterns, find out, do you see our male children more accident prone, that type of thing. But you can't say that until you know which children are which. So that's an area that I'm really excited to see developed more.
And with Windover, that's especially important because over 52% of the 168 people that came out of the pond were juveniles. I mean, that child mortality was very high, so the majority of individuals from the pond were children. So if we could sex those children and determine whether they were male or female, it's going to give us a lot more information. And so, maybe one day we'll have that magic DNA test that can tell us whether it was male or female.
A question over here. Yeah.
I was wanting to know, where are the remains housed and what kind of environment do you keep them in?
They're at the department in kind of metal casings with kind of acid-free padding and covers. So they're kind of in little drawers inside the department, so air-conditioned, climate-controlled area. And the remains have been treated, so they're not deteriorating anymore. Yeah, we're just very, very, very careful with them.
I had another question. Have you been able to see any familial traits in any of the skeletons so that you can say this may be a family group here?
Chris Stojanowski, who is a bioarchaeologist who I trained under, he was at Florida State when I came there. He's done some, he looks at dental metrics and dental morphology, meaning the way certain teeth are shaped, because we can trace lineage based on these, the shapes of certain teeth. And I think, gosh, it's been so long since I read that article, I think he was able to, he determined that there was more variety among the females.
Yeah, in their burial location, yeah. So he was comparing kind of familial patterns to location within the pond. And he found that the females seemed to be a little bit more varied and spread out, and the males were a little bit more clustered.
And I also thought, and I may be mistaken, but I also thought that there was a bit more variety in some of these dental traits among the women, which may indicate that this was a patrilocal, that the women were coming from the outside because they were more variable, whereas the males were slightly more the same. So we can look at things like that. Even
arranged marriages.
Yeah, and where were the women coming from? Where were the men coming from?
DNA would really help with that as well.
Yeah.
But it's also what we call exogamy. In other words, the need to marry out of a group. So, group exogamy is a very important thing. So we may be able to really comment on that. It's
or maybe see where they're coming from.
Right,
if they are coming from outside the region.
There and then
Based on the excavation, have you been able to identify what kind of plants or maybe animals were around that might have interfered with the lines in that?
Yes.
In the Bible here, there is a really very good chapter on the plants by Lee Newsom, who's at Penn State University. She actually is a Florida product from the University of Florida, and one of probably the best archaeobotanists in the East. And so there's a lot of information on different kinds of plants and plant use. The animals, around 10,000 years ago, the megafauna become extinct in just a brief time. They're gone. But the other animals that have been here all along, deer, wolves, bears, possums, raccoons, skunks, everything else, they've been here all along, but now they become the prey choices, essentially. They become the resources. And we see two things. We see animals and animal products that are buried with people. And what I mean by animal products, for example, antler. Antler is a great resource for different kinds of things, from atlatl hooks to tools of various kinds. Another animal product would be long bone fragments that are shaped into awls and things of this sort for basketry or for textiles. So we see animal products buried with people. We also have an awful lot of vertebrate fauna that came from the pond itself. And most of that, we think, is just the normal fauna in the pond over many thousands of years. Okay? There also are invertebrates. And the invertebrates are very interesting because they kind of occur in different patterns. In one stratum we may find a certain kind of snail, in another we find something else. And this tells us really about hydrology and also about the ecology of the pond. So there's a lot that can be learned. But there is a very good section on the plants in here. There's not much on animals with regard to what's in the pond. However, the Pender's chapter in here, Tom Pender's chapter on the bone tools and things of that sort, tells us pretty much what species are being used to make tools and things of that sort.
And another important aspect that the plants were able to shed light on was not only diet, what type of plants they were utilizing, but it also told us about the seasonality of the site, because as Dr. Marrinan had said earlier, we're really curious about where these people were coming from, where they were going, how much time they were spending at a particular place. And from looking at the botanical remains at Windover, what they were able to surmise was that this pond was utilized probably in the late summer, early fall. So it may have been a spot that was part of their annual migration. Where they were beforehand, we don't know, but that they were spending this kind of section of the year, and whoever happened to die during that time was buried in the pond, and then eventually they just moved on to, whether they were following animals or plants or just seasonal sites. But that was another really important piece of information, that because of the level of preservation of the plant remains, they were able to tell that.
One of the things we know about hunters and gatherers is that they have a very intimate knowledge of their environments and are present when things are available. And so these are still questions we have, and some of these things may offer some answers.
All the way in the back.
Does Native American hostility to anthropology have an impact on your ability to expand the scope of these discoveries?
Dr. Marrinan?
In what way?
You can explore this because it's old enough. But as the time gets closer and closer to identifiable tribes, there are now laws that Native Americans have passed.
Right.
And those that still have their reservations don't like you guys around.
Well, actually, there are a good many Native American archaeologists these days, many more than in the past. I think there's more understanding on both parts of what we're trying to do. I think there's more respect for human remains. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 is really what you're alluding to. And it's a very interesting act. 2 days ago, I got a NAGPRA, as we call it, request from the Chugach Indians of southern Alaska, asking me what we hold of theirs. Right. I mean, this is a kind of fishing expedition, but I went to our accession book, and I determined that there were 3 things that we have from southern Alaska, none of which are attributed to the Chugach. But my job is now to, communicate that to them, to show them what we have, and basically as information. So with the Windover remains, we try to be as respectful as possible. We want not to anger anybody, but we think that this is a population, not just a collection, but this is a population of people who have a lot of answers to questions, some of which we've asked already, and some of which we don't know we want to ask at the present time.
Yeah, I have been wondering what the reaction of the current Native Americans might have been to the Windover discovery.
Well, when we're talking about Florida, we're not talking about the cultural continuity that we have in other parts of the country, because the Aboriginal populations that were here at the time of European contact are gone. The recognized tribes we have in Florida today are really migrants from other areas, from further up north.
Is there any way to determine from the DNA and other evidence that you have from the pond whether or not these people could have been the ancestors of tribes like the Ais that are on the coast?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have DNA from contact period tribes, so we can't compare them to who those people were, because we're all curious, were these people, did they turn into the Calusa or the Ais or some of these contact period groups? But we'll probably never know because of the fact that, we don't have good, well-preserved remains from contact period. And now, of course, we can compare them, as Jeff said, to modern living tribes, but so far, Windover is a very unique haplogroup. It's not matching up with these modern groups.
Okay, another question over here.
I had a question about if we took a snapshot and looked at one generation, what was their range that they were expected to travel? Because I see the lithic points were from a quarry 81 miles away, but the coast at that time may have been to the east, maybe the same distance. Would it have been, and doctors, you didn't think that they maybe traveled to the coast, would that could have been because the geography was much more hazardous to go that way as compared? So I'm kind of wondering how much that they're moving around within a generation.
We don't know, okay. But let me say a couple of things. Your comment about sea level is very apt, because the state of Florida has its modern geography, its modern coastal edges, really, I think, around 45 to 5,000 years ago. So at this time, the coast may have been considerably further out. It's just hard to know that specifically. The mastodon that's here, that you have, that the cast, basically, of the mastodon out here, is actually from the Osceola River up in our neck of the woods. And that work is ongoing there. And in fact, that area, the Osceola River, has really pushed back the presence of people in Florida to around 14,500 years ago, which is before Clovis. This work is continuing, and we can also, interestingly enough, the Osceola River is not a meandering river. It's a river that's cut its way through limestone, and it's kept pretty much the same channel through time, and we can trace it out onto the drown shelf, and we can find sites around it. It's a very interesting process, and so I say stay tuned, because there's work going on in that area, which I think you all will find. If you're interested in this, you'll find this very interesting too, because we're trying to work on this. But I also want to say that a couple of weeks ago, I guess it was the first week in October, there was a 3-day conference in Monticello, Florida, on Paleo-Indians, and people came from all over the country to present papers and to talk about Paleo-Indians, the first people in the U.S. And it was very interesting. And what surprised me was the people working on Paleo-Indian are very interested in the Windover folks, because they don't have human remains, many human remains. There are some, but not very many. And so they're very interested in DNA sequencing of the entire Windover population, if and when that's ever possible. because they feel that that will be an important adjunct to their work, to see these very early people. And with the small amount of DNA that we have available on Paleo Indians, they think that this will be a real
Okay,
help.
we have lots of questions here. Diane?
I have a general question about the burials when they were done with their grave goods. How wet or dry was the original burial?
Very
Well,
wet.
Yeah, and that's a question we get a lot because people often wonder, well, was this just a cemetery that became inundated over time, or was it actually a pond? But part of their research and some of their original research questions was determining what was the extent of the pond, how long has that pond been here, and through core sampling and looking at the geology and looking at the strata, as Dr. Marrinan mentioned, they were able to determine that that pond started accumulating 10,000 years ago, and they've actually been able to go through and date all the different types and temporal periods of the peat deposit. So it was a wet pond at the time of the burial. So these burials were actually bundled and submerged below the surface of the water intentionally. Over half of them had erections of sticks over the bodies to anchor them to the base of the pond. So these are very complicated, very complex, intentional burials that occurred beneath the water line.
And you can see that in the exhibit too.
It's my understanding that only part of the pond was excavated, so there may be many more bodies. Is there any plan to excavate the rest of the pond at any future point?
Not today.
You know,
Not today.
although there were remains left in the pond, the majority of the active parts of the pond were excavated. I mean, according to Glenn, they felt they got the majority of the skeletal material. They had actually shifted the position of the road, moved it over to allow for the excavations. They did that twice, thanks to Jim Swan. But by the time they were still going into the third field season, yes, they were still finding some elements protruding from the walls, but at that point with 168 individuals, that's a good sample size. So they realized, look, let's just fill it in, close it up, and work with what we have. So it's not like the pond's, full of remains. The majority of it has been. And now with NAG provisions and the complexity of excavating human remains in North America, I think they'd only go back if there was something, happening with the pond, if the site became endangered somehow.
Oh, okay.
Considering that the Windover people were just a subpopulation of the entire population, was there an estimate of how many people may have made up the whole group of Windover folks?
Let me just talk about population estimates. My background, what I work on is Spanish missions, okay? And in the Tallahassee area, we are blessed to have a number of them. We don't know how many exactly, and we don't know where they are, all of them, but we have found, I think, about 10. We would like to know what the population of Appalachia Province, just an area from the Osceola River to the Ocklawahnee River was. It is said to be 30,000 at the time of contact, probably at the beginning of missionization. Who knows? Hispaniola, for example, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I worked there in the early 80s on Spanish Town. We would like to know the populations there. Some people give the population of Hispaniola at the time of contact at 1 million. And everybody disappears. Okay, everyone is gone. Within about 20 to 25 years, Spaniards are bringing in Lucayan, Bahamian Indians to run their mining operations and their cattle ranching and things of that sort. So trying to deal with population at any time in prehistory and even in early history in the Western Hemisphere is very, very difficult. It's a great question. We would all like to know. So this is where I usually say, if we had a time machine, we could go back and look at this. But the truth is, to have a time machine, you would have to have a precise idea of where you want it to be. And radiocarbon dates are not absolute dates. For example, radiocarbon dates have a standard deviation, plus or minus 50 years, something like that. So that's 100 years, you know. Anyway, population is very, very hard to know. It really is. And we would all love to know what the native population of Beringia was. This land bridge, for example, that existed for thousands of years apparently, and you know, it may well be, as some people think, that people moved out of Siberia into the Beringian area and lived there for a number of generations before they ever came down the coast or came through an ice-free corridor or anything into this area. So I think one of the things that's really exciting right now about archaeology is that there are so many ideas about the peopling of the New World that are being tossed about, whether they're all from Asia, whether some of them might have come along the ice edge from Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula, basically France or Spain.
And that they may have come in small boats as opposed to walking across the bridge, I think is one of the things that's happening.
I think that
skin boats.
it's hard to know about boats. Now, we've always had a problem here in Florida because we kind of assumed that people had boats, but we didn't really know for sure. I think it was 1999 or so in the Gainesville area when Noonan's Lake was extremely low, and there was all this lumber, all these logs and things sticking out of the sand, and somebody wanted to get a permit to deadhead a lot of this stuff because these kinds of logs for carpenters, woodworkers and things are priceless, really. But come to find out, a lot of those logs, over 100 of them, were canoes, all on the northeast side of Noonan's Lake. We don't quite understand why that is, but the radiocarbon dates on a number of them showed that we have dug out canoes basically back to almost, I think, 7,000 BC. So could these people have had waterborne transport? Yes. We don't really know the longevity of waterborne transport in this hemisphere.
And this is something Doran and I always argued about, because when I was looking at a lot of the skeletal fractures, you know, they're of the forearms, and Doran's convinced they kept stumbling out of their canoes. You and I would go round and round about this. And
I think they were whacking each other with their paddles. You guys do that.
Well, our panelists will be here to answer some more of your questions, and Rachel will be out signing copies of her book if you're interested, and Brian Owens, the sculptor of our beautiful Windover woman sculpture, will be back in the exhibit to talk to you as well. I would like to ask you, we've got on the back area there forms, evaluation forms, and it'll be very helpful. We have some pencils and some forms. If you would take a moment, it just takes really a second. There's a few brief questions. If you would fill that out, it would be very helpful to us. And I want to thank our panel again, Patrisha Meyers, Director of the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and which is home to the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute, Dr. Rachel Wentz, author of Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, and several other books. Dr. Rochelle Marrinan, Chair of the Florida State University Department of Anthropology, and Dr. Geoffrey Thomas, Specialist Faculty at FSU Department of Anthropology. Please thank them for being here. Thanks to you and the Florida Humanities Council for sponsoring this.